Okay, here's what we got up to yesterday. We saw that moral principles, moral rules, general ideas about what's right and what's wrong can be known without any command from God. And we'll be held responsible for those things, even if God never tells us about them. So the idea that God's command creates morality is simply wrong. The question then becomes, if we can know the general principles of right and wrong without God telling us, is God relevant to morality at all? Do God's commands have any purchase? Do they have any authority? We know ourselves what's right and wrong. The answer is that when I make a concrete judgment about what's right or wrong to do in a particular circumstance, I'm relying on two things. I'm relying on my moral rules, and I'm relying on my understanding of the facts of the case. One can challenge a person's moral judgment about what to do just by challenging his facts. Doctor says it's right and good medicine to bleed people when they have fevers. When we attack that, we don't say you're immoral. We don't say that you're evil. We don't say you're a criminal. What we say is you got wrong facts. You don't know what bleeding does. You don't know what effect it has. We challenge his moral judgment, but only on the grounds that he has wrong facts. We don't challenge his moral principles at all. We simply say your medicine is out of date. Now, my suggestion was, as I told you, I learned this from John Stuart Mill. My suggestion was, God is relevant to morality because the moral principles that we have are sensitive to the fact of God's existence and God's activity, so that given the moral principles and the fact that God is active in various ways, it will come out that when God says to do something, it'll be morally obligatory to do it. Not because he creates morality, he doesn't create morality, but because morality is such that when you add into your general moral principles what God does in the world, the result is that he gets a certain moral authority for what he says. The example that I gave was gratitude. Gratitude is a moral principle. It applies to everyone who benefits me. When a person benefits me, I owe him something. If he wants something from me, I have to take that seriously. I have some moral obligation to pay attention to what he wants from me. God benefits me, so he's one of those to whom I have a moral debt. And that being the case, when he says he wants certain things from me, I have to take that seriously. I have to give that at least some moral weight. Now, the general background, again, is that when you're talking about a concrete moral judgment, you're talking about your moral principles and your conception of the facts. Very often, when people have concrete moral judgments that they seem to be committed to, on the one hand, and the Torah has a different stand as to what should be done, the difference has nothing to do with moral principles. The difference has to do with facts. The Torah has a certain set of a picture of what the relevant facts are, and the person from an external perspective, of course, doesn't look at the world with those facts. He has a different set of facts in his head. So the differences between the two perspectives is not a difference of moral principles, it's a difference of the facts that they recognize. When you are looking for a clear example of something which in your mind is right, and the Torah says is wrong, remember, the first line of investigation is, maybe the Torah says it's wrong because the Torah has a different set of facts, which would mean that the difference in the judgment of right and wrong would have no moral significance whatsoever. It would only have a difference of significance of fact. When you take into account divine providence, this has a gigantic effect. Because when you see something happen that looks like a terrible injustice, it might not be an injustice, because you don't know the background of the person who's suffering. You don't know where he came from. You don't know what his other conditions are. You don't know what would have happened if this hadn't happened to him, what he was on his way to do, or what other things would have developed. We have no way of knowing those facts. So for us to say, we think X is right, and the Torah says X is wrong, I'll give you a simple example. This Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote about 60, 70 years ago. Abortion. Suppose you have a test that tells you long before birth that the child is going to be born impaired in certain ways. The current fashion is kill it. Why should an impaired child be born and suffer and cause his parents so much grief and effort and expense? If you look at the life of a human being as simply the career of a body, I think that point of view is defensible. Maybe there could be other critiques and other things, the slippery slope arguments and the rest, but it's defensible. It's natural. It's something which you can hear as a reasonable starting point for a discussion. Suppose you look at human life as the career of a soul. And the body that a soul is attached to isn't accidental. And the qualities of that body, positive and negative, strengths and weaknesses, are exactly what that soul needs for the next step in its development, including its disabilities. There's a difference of fact. There's nothing to do with morality now. What is a human being? What is a human life? What are the circumstances under which it develops? What are the consequences? If you look at it from a religious point of view, you're going to have an entirely different judgment as to whether abortion is right or wrong. This is not a moral issue. It's an issue about the facts behind the situation. I'll give you another example, which is, let me give some examples because I think that people are stuck on this. There's a big discussion in philosophy of something called moral luck. A aims the gun at B, pulls the trigger, the bullet flies true and kills B. C aims the gun at D, aims it perfectly, pulls the trigger, there's a sudden gust of wind that blows the bullet aside, and D is saved. In philosophy, it's recognized that we have conflicting intuitions about these two cases. A committed murder. C did not commit murder. So, C is not a nice guy. He tried to commit murder. He's guilty of attempted murder, but he didn't commit murder. On the other hand, the difference between the two events is only a gust of wind. Gust of wind that's under no one's control. Does C deserve any credit that a gust of wind blew his bullet aside? And by what you would call in secular terms luck, he isn't a murderer? Why should that affect my judgment of him at all? Why should that affect my judgment of the event at all? And whatever is done to A should be done to C without any difference whatsoever, because the difference between the two is just a gust of wind. Now, people struggle with this in secular terms, and secular philosophy doesn't have a good resolution of this type of intuition. In our context, the problem never arises. Notice my words. I didn't say we can solve it. There's a big difference. We can't solve it, but the problem never arises. It never arises because the gust of wind isn't an accident. It isn't moral luck. God wanted A's attempt to kill B to succeed, and God wanted C's attempt to kill D not to succeed. Who knows why? Maybe D doesn't deserve to die. Maybe C shouldn't be punished as a murderer, and that's why it blew aside. Or for some other reason that we can't imagine. We don't say that it's wrong, unjust, morally indefensible that A should be punished as a murderer and C should not. Because since God arranged that C shouldn't succeed in committing murder, God doesn't want C punished as a murderer. And then it's perfectly right, perfectly explained without any difficulty whatsoever. Why we'll punish A, we won't punish C. That's because we have a principle of divine providence, and we say the gust of the wind isn't luck. If you say the gust of the wind is luck, then you have a difficult moral problem. I'm just showing you that when you try to compare moral judgments, secular moral judgments as against Torah moral judgments, very, very often the difference is going to be in the background of fact. It's not going to be a moral issue at all. Yes, your question now.
You're saying that the gust of wind or not aborting the child is an act of God because that's what Hashem wants.
The gust of wind, for sure. Right.
That's
right.
Or that for the bullet not to kill a person.
That's right.
But what's not to say that Hashem doesn't want the guy to be killed or the baby not to be aborted?
In the case of the gust of wind, God caused the gust of wind to blow the bullet aside. That's our view.
Yeah.
So obviously, he didn't want him to be killed. If God had wanted him to be killed, then it would have come out like A and B. And the gust of wind would not have occurred, and the bullet would have struck D, and D would have died. I don't think that's a difficult inference. As far as the abortion is concerned, God gave us rules to live by. If I had to guess what God wants, the whole thing would be incompetent. We are incompetent. We're usually incompetent to guess what other people are thinking, let alone what the creator of the universe is thinking. If he hadn't told me what he wants, I wouldn't have a clue. I would say nothing at all. Our religion isn't based on intuition and creativity and sensitivity and all the rest. It's based on revelation. And he tells us he doesn't want abortion under certain conditions. Certain conditions where abortion is okay, but just for disabilities, abortion is not okay. Yes?
What I understand is if we believe in divine providence, then how can we judge any morality? Because if God didn't want him to shoot him, he would have either not let him shoot him or not given him the idea to shoot him or made the gust of wind to stop the bullets. I mean, how can we judge any morality at all if we believe in divine providence?
Because morality is based on free will, and God creates the human being with the capacity of free will. That's an axiom of Jewish thought. And the verses in the Torah actually say it. I've placed before you this day good and evil, life and death, therefore choose life. So obviously you have the ability to make your own choice.
So what is the extent of divine providence? Can God cause a person to act in a certain way, or does he only have control over weather? Like what is it?
Okay, you're asking a very important question, and your vocabulary, if you'll sit and go over it carefully, your vocabulary slips from one side of an important divide to the other. You asked about divine's providence, and then you asked about what God can do. You asked about his power. Those are two different conceptions. Providence is what he does. Power is what he can do. No agent exercises all his power. Sometimes he chooses not to exercise his power. God can, of course, force us to move in one way or another. God can cancel out our free will. He can do that. But because he wants us to make our own choices and be responsible for our actions, he doesn't do that. Providence doesn't overrule free will, usually, almost always. There are certain exceptions, but almost always, providence doesn't overrule free will. God wants us to make our own choices and then live with the consequences of our choices. You have a question? No, sorry. Yes.
I understand how this works in terms of something that your thoughts conflicting with something that the Torah says, but what if there's a scenario where you've got, say, two people who disagree on something being moral or immoral, and neither in this issue is mute when it comes to the Torah. It's not against it or for it. It's just
if there were such a thing,
subjective.
so then the Torah would have no interest in the outcome.
But how would you determine which of the two
You wouldn't.
would be
But on your supposition, oh, you mean how would people do it?
Yeah.
Okay. There's something that's called in philosophical discussion reflective equilibrium. What you do is you consider the principles that you think are reasonable and natural, and you consider concrete cases about which you have concrete intuitions, and you try to make the most consistent set of intuitions that you can. Play one off against the other, you try to reconcile contradictions, and you make progress in the sense that you learn more and more about what needs to be done as more and more investigations take place. There's something called utilitarianism. Yeah. Anybody here heard of utilitarianism? Okay. Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and then there Peter Singer. It has a natural appeal. You want to know what to do? Do that action which will create the greatest balance of pleasure over pain for all people considered that you can. There are some obvious, well-known, brutal counterexamples. There are 10 people on an island. They are living there. They're going to die there. No one's going to ever hear about them or discover them. Their remains will be washed away by a tsunami. 9 of them would get a great kick out of torturing the 10th. According to utilitarianism, they must torture him. They must! Because that is the action that will give the greatest balance of pleasure over pain for those 10 people, and they're the only people involved, because no one else is going to find out about this. That's crazy. That's crazy. That was brought up in the 50s, and a very good philosopher named J.J.C. Smart wrote a paper saying, golly, this is a real problem with utilitarianism, but I'm so convinced by utilitarianism, I've got to say that it's right for them to torture him. They laughed him out of the room. That's because where are you starting from? You're starting from your intuitive judgments. Okay, acting in such a way as to maximize pleasure over pain has an intuitive appeal. So does not torturing somebody, because you'll get a kick out of it, have an appeal. What about pleasure, the pleasure of a sadist? Does his pleasure count in the calculation? He gets pleasure out of torturing other people. When I calculate all the pleasure that a particular alternative will generate, do I count the pleasure of the sadist, or do I say, no, that pleasure is evil pleasure? that pleasure isn't morally a positive pleasure. It's morally negative in and of itself, so it shouldn't count. Then obviously you're making judgments against utilitarianism and outside of utilitarianism. So then you say, okay, utilitarianism can't be the whole story. So then you go looking for something else with which you could modify it. And it's a gigantic literature on this, but that's how it goes. You take a position, you consider application of the position, consider your intuitions about that, and you try to come to a reflective equilibrium where you have the most consistent set of intuitions that you can get. That's how progress is made in this area. John Rawls introduced this in his political philosophy, and others took it up, and actually Nelson Goodman did it in epistemology. It's a well-known move. You can look it up, reflective equilibrium. You can look it up on the net. At any rate, so that's how God is relevant to morality. I'll tell you where John Stuart Mill said this. He said this in a letter. It's not in his books. Someone said to him, Mill, you believe in balance of pleasure over pain. You're taking an atheist position. You're not using God in your morality at all. Mill replied, you're making a mistake. I'm not taking an atheist position. I'm taking a neutral position. If God exists, then his happiness counts also. It counts along with everybody else's happiness. And maybe if he's an infinite being, so his happiness counts more than everybody else's happiness. My criterion is neutral. It works in a world with no God, and it works in a world with God. And in a world with God, it could be that God's will gets tremendous purchase. I'm not taking an atheist position, I'm taking a neutral position. I thought that was a brilliant move, and that's the move that I'm using here. I'm saying we have moral principles. The moral principles are neutral. They're not prejudiced one way or the other. Given the facts about God, that then indicates. Now, here's an example of how this will apply, and it touches on the example that you were talking about yesterday. Let's suppose you have a court case, and someone was convicted, and he's punished, and it turns out that he was innocent. So, in secular terms, that's an absolute injustice, and he has suffered evil, and so forth and so on. But we have a verse. A verse says, Elokim nitzab ad haskel, God stands in the congregation of God, which is the court, and that means that the decision that the court gives is right for that person. Okay, he didn't commit this crime. What about other crimes he committed that nobody knows about? And then you can say, he deserved the punishment. He deserved the punishment not for the advertised crime, but for something else that God knows about and we don't know about. Once you admit that the facts influence the rightness or wrongness of the event, and we don't possess nearly all of the facts, it's going to be very difficult to pin down a moral disagreement between a secular point of view and what the Torah says. Because the Torah can be taking into account a myriad of facts that we don't have access to. It's going to be very, very difficult to do. Are we together? Okay, that's what I wanted to say about religion and morality. Now, who sent me the email about biblical criticism and about, oh, you did, okay. I'd like to go through this in some detail. It's a good example of how you can quote, and the quotes can be accurate, well, sort of accurate, and you can draw conclusions, and more detailed study of the textual background and more careful assessment of the logic show you that the conclusions are utterly unwarranted, and indeed perhaps the opposite conclusion is warranted. There is a principle that the text of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, were written by Moses, letter by letter. God dictated it letter by letter, and Moses took the dictation. It all comes from God through Moses to us. Here are 2 sources that people use to challenge this idea. One is that the Talmud records a debate about the last 8 verses of the Torah. Who wrote them? Did Moses write them or did Joshua write them? Why should there be a problem? Because the last 8 verses of the Torah describe Moses' death. They start with, and Moses died. Well, who wrote that? If Moses wrote it, we have no problem about Moses writing about the future. Moses is a prophet. That's not difficult. But he wrote it in the past tense. So imagine Moses writing, and Moses died. When he's writing those words, they're false. They'll become true in a few hours, but when he writes them, they're false words. If the word said Moses will die, that would be fine, but it doesn't say that. It says Moses died. So one says that he wrote them bedema, whatever that means, and the other says, no, Joshua wrote them. So this has been used for many years. I only solved this about 2 years ago. I couldn't believe my blindness. It's been used by many to say, you see, it doesn't all come from Moses. The Talmud itself admits, at least one position of the Talmud is, that the last 8 verses come from Joshua. They don't come from Moses. If you listen carefully to my vocabulary, you'll see that I just shifted the vocabulary. I didn't say over what I said before. When I do that, I'm doing it on purpose. Okay? I'm just giving you a hint. Another one is this. There are a number of cases where the Torah writes something, and there's a comment in the Midrash that this verse is a tikkun sofrim. Tikkun means rectifying something, fixing something. Sofrim means a certain type of sage. And in the Midrash Tanchuma, it says, a tikkun sofrim of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, who lived at the beginning of the Second Temple period. These words are a rectification, an emendation, a fixing of the sages of the men of the Great Assembly. And the examples that you'll be provided with are cases where what's written is okay, but in context, something else should have been written. And in context, what should have been written would have been, in a certain way, insulting to God. Would have been insulting to God. And the thought is, when God wrote it, he wrote it straightforwardly in the literal way, and in the way that did imply insult. And the rabbis, 1,000 years later, changed it because they couldn't tolerate a text in which God would have to suffer this insult, so they changed it in order to avoid that insult. And then the thought is, well, if the rabbis 1,000 years later made these changes, and there are like 15 or 20 of them, they made those changes, so then the text doesn't all come from Moses. And changes have been made. And changes were made willy-nilly, and who knows when they stopped, and who knows how many more could have been made. And we can't trust that the text represents Moses at all. And the door is open now as a Pandora's box to simply detaching the text from Moses. Okay, let's start with the first one. There's a statement in the Talmud that the last 8 verses were written by Joshua, not by Moses. Let's pay very careful attention to the words. There aren't so many of them. The last 8 verses were written by Joshua. Written. That means pen to parchment with ink. Written down by Joshua. Does that say to whom they were communicated? What their source was? How they were delivered? It doesn't say anything about that. It talks about putting the pen on the parchment with ink. The obvious understanding is that God dictated those verses to Moses and said to Moses, tell Joshua to write them down after you're dead, so that when they're written, they shouldn't be false. Nothing in the Talmudic statement rules out that understanding of the process. That being the case, all of the Torah comes from God through Moses to us, down to the very last letter. All of it comes from God through Moses to us. The only question is who made the ink marks on the parchment. That's all. That's a trivial question. It has nothing to do with the origin or the authority or adding to the Torah later. It has nothing to do with it. It just has nothing to do with it. So it's a non-starter. It's a non-starter. Okay, now what about the idea of the men of the Great Assembly making changes 1,000 years later? Let's say I take that straight. I'll give you reasons not to take it straight in a minute. But suppose I take it straight. Would that really open the Pandora's box to say that whole sections like the book of Deuteronomy were written 1,000 years later, and when they were discovered in the temple and so forth and so on? Would it really open the door to that? The men of the Great Assembly were 120 in number, and they had among them the last prophets. At the very most, what you could say is, if this body of 120, with the last prophets among them, changed something in the Torah, then a similar body could also change something in the Torah. Not every Tom, Dick, and Harry at any time in history could change whatever he likes. That certainly wouldn't follow. Secondly, according to the critic, what he's saying is not true, but according to the critic, the cases are cases where if what was written, if what was originally written had been written that would have been insulting to God, and they changed it to protect God's honor. All you could infer from that is that changes could be made to protect God's honor from otherwise writing it in a way that would impinge upon his honor. Nothing else can be inferred from that. Changes could be made to change historical events or the honor of the king or something. You can't infer that. So even if I took it seriously, if I took it literally, you couldn't generalize from it and say the text is hodgepodge and people change things at all times and there's no reason to trace it back to Moses. It's not inconceivable that God could say, I wrote it this way, and after 1,000 years, I want it a different way. That's not inconceivable. Not inconceivable. It might violate certain rules, but it's not inconceivable. But the truth is worse than that. Much worse than that. First of all, if you go back to ancient manuscripts, my Chavrusa did this 30 years ago when I first came. He went to the Hebrew University and looked at manuscripts of this Midrash, the Midrash Tanchuma. Some have the words that it was done, it was an imitation of the sages of the men of the Great Assembly, and some texts don't have those words. Some texts don't have those words. That leaves open the following possibility. Tikkun Sofrim is a literary style. I'll give you an example. Let me give you a concrete example so you have something in mind. Abraham has a circumcision, and in Vayera, the Torah starts, God appeared to Abraham. Then the three strangers come, and Abraham runs to give them hospitality, and gives them hospitality and sees them off on their way to Sodom. And then it says that Abraham that God came back to where Abraham was standing. Now, if you read the sequence, that doesn't sound right. Abraham's here, God appears to him, Abraham runs off, does what he does, and then it's Abraham who comes back. Then the text would imply that God is waiting for Abraham. God came and God is waiting for Abraham. And God sort of stood there and waited while Abraham ran off and did what he did, and God was waiting for Abraham. That sounds a little less than honorable to treat God as waiting for a human being. So what the Torah says is God came back to Abraham. So that's called a Tikkun Sofrim. Now, if you read Tikkun Sofrim literally, that means some sages at some point or other erased the original text and they wrote it in a new text. But there's another way to read it. Tikkun Sofrim is a style. It's a literary style. It's where, following the sequence of events, you would expect X, and X would be insulting to someone of honor, and therefore the original writer wrote Y instead of X because he didn't want to write something that would be insulting to someone who doesn't deserve to be insulted. That's the way the text was originally written. Tikkun Sofrim now becomes a name of a literary style. It's not a description of a historical event, of changing a text. It's a question of understanding what the text means on the basis of its style. Just like, for example, when God says to conquer the land of Canaan, he says you'll find cities fortified to the heavens. The Talmud says it's exaggeration. It's exaggeration. They weren't fortified to the heavens. That doesn't mean the text is wrong. That doesn't mean anybody tampered with the text. It means that God, when he writes a text, uses exaggeration and uses it to express the feeling they had when they looked at the fortification. They thought, oh, this is impossible. It's just overwhelming. It's just inconceivable. So the Torah used the words to the heavens. It's explaining the style of the text. It's not talking about anybody tampering with the text. Here too, Tikkun Sofrim, rectification of the sages or the scholars, can mean that the text is written in such a way as not to explicitly express something that's detrimental to God's honor. And that's why it's written the way it is. We have to realize that, in fact, the meaning of it is what wasn't written, and it just doesn't write it in that way. Now, that's certainly open as a way to understand what the Midrash says, especially since the words, the men of the Great Assembly, are not found in some ancient texts. In the modern printings of the Tanchuma, they appear in parentheses, and the footnotes say not all texts have this. But more than that, if you go through, this is in Tanchum and Parshas B'Shalach, that's for the recording, somebody who wants to look it up. If you go through it, you'll see there are another 15 at least examples, some of which have nothing to do with God, nothing to do with God's honor. They have to do with the sensitivity of the person in the circumstances that he's talking. So, Moses says to God, after the golden calf, and Moses is pleading with God for mercy and not to destroy the Jewish people. And he says to God, if you'll forgive them, then wonderful. And if you don't, blot me out of the book that you've written, let me die, so that I will not see my evil. Why would he see his evil? What should have been written is, I won't see their evil, the evil that's going to happen to them, the destruction that will happen. I don't want to see that. But he doesn't want to say their destruction, their evil. He doesn't want to use that term with respect to them. So he says, my evil. It isn't literally true. It isn't his evil that's in question. It's their evil that's in question. But he doesn't say that. No one is going to suggest that 1,000 years later, the sages of the Great Assembly changed the text in order to protect Moses against this statement, which might have been hurtful for him to say. At most, the critic wants to say that the sages did it for theological purposes. There's no theological purpose here. Just Moses doesn't want to say their evil. So he says, my evil. There's another case. Aaron pleads with Moses to pray on behalf of Miriam. Miriam gets taras, leprosy, because of a crime that she committed. And Aaron says to Moses, let her not be like a person on the brink of death whose flesh is rotted away from the womb of his mother. So the reader says, oh, his mother meaning this abstract person whom you're talking about. This very Midrash says, no, it should have said our mother, because Aaron and Miriam are brother and sister. Should have been our mother. Instead of saying our mother, it says his mother to push it off onto an anonymous third party. There's no theological import here. There's nothing that has to be protected in your official belief system here. It's just a question of understanding that Aaron was sensitive to talking about his mother, so he made it into a third person, their mother. There's a place where God, I think the beginning of the book of Isaiah, where God is complaining against the Jewish people, and it speaks about they don't know. They're like unlike animals who know who their masters are. They don't know who their masters are, and they exchanged his honor for something that doesn't help. Now, in context, what God should have said is, they exchanged my honor for something that doesn't help. They went after other gods. They were guilty of idol worship. It doesn't say my honor. It says there, God is describing the failure of the Jewish people. There's no theological impact here. Nothing in our belief system. It's just God is sensitive not to directly accuse them of acting against his God's honor. So he says his honor is something as if it were somebody else. There's no theological import here. I don't think it's the least bit credible to say that 1,000 years later, it said my honor, they changed it to lessen God's description of the crime of the Jewish people. It's just, so if these are in the same list, they're in the same list of what's called Tikkun Sofrim, the critic hasn't got a chance. The critic can't say that the rabbis were afraid of verses that would damage their delicate belief system and they want to hide the truth from the unsuspecting public and they changed it. It's simply not true. These are cases where there are matters of honor, matters of sensitivity, and it's a textual style, not to be brutal about the way in which you write the truth. I'll give you one more example, and we'll quit. When the Jews multiply in Egypt, before the Jews multiply, the Egyptians are afraid of them, and they want to stop them from multiplying. And they say, maybe there'll be a war, and the Jews will join our enemies, and they'll win the war, and the Jews will leave the land. So Rashi says right away, the Jews will leave the land? What are you talking about? That fertile area, that area that has unlimited fertility, on the contrary, if they and the enemies will leave the land, they'll kick you out. They're not going to leave. Why should they leave? They haven't shown any signs of leaving, no restiveness whatsoever. But the Egyptian is going to say that. He's not going to say something in which he's describing his own destruction, so he puts it onto them. That no one's suggesting that the rabbis of the Great Assembly changed that in order to protect what? The Egyptian statement about their own implications for themselves. It's a way of writing, it's a style of writing where sensitive subjects are hidden behind a circumlocution, a paraphrase, which doesn't indicate at all what the true meaning is. And the one who knows this understands it's written this way, but it means the other way, and just written this way because that's the style. And there's no implication whatsoever that anybody ever tampered with the text. Yeah, we've got to dive in that.